A lot of people think that what they call the problem of nihilism is an important, or indeed the central, philosophical problem that we have to face, or we should face up to. But I think that, and what they mean by that, of course, is they have a sense that people in the modern world don't know how to orient themselves. They don't know what they ought to want. They don't know what normative conceptions should be binding on them. They don't know how to give their life meaning. All of these things are part of what they take to be the problem of nihilism. And they think that nihilism is a very serious problem because it means, well, nihil means nothing at all. Nihilum, not a bean. So they think we have not a bean of meaning, or not a bean of normative, justified normative structure, or not a bean of way of orienting ourselves in the world. And how do we get that? This is a big problem, and we need to analyze it, and we need to address it. Now, it seems to me that that formulating this as a philosophical problem in that way, and seeing it as a huge particular problem in that way, is misconstruing the situation completely. And it's partly a way of misconstruing the situation which results from a non-historical way of thinking about the world and of thinking about us. That is, the assumption of this way of going about philosophy, saying that we're confronted with this philosophical problem of nihilism, the assumptions of posing the question in that way are that we are somehow in the position of disinterested and disembodied spirits. We're like Cartesian selves, who are completely outside the world, outside history. We have no history, we have no character, we have no embeddedness in the world, we have no commitments. And now from that situation, how could we ever have any reason to do anything? Why should I do anything? Why should I think anything has value? Why should I think I ought to do anything? And now my suggestion is that if you set the question up in that way, you've set it up in a way that ensures you're not going to get an answer. Because of course, if you start from the assumption that we're completely disinterested agents, completely disinterested entities, we're out of history, we have no desires, we have no commitments, then of course such entities couldn't possibly be given an argument that would tell them that they ought to want something, or they ought to structure their lives in one way rather than another, or they ought to have normative conceptions of a certain kind. But in fact, we're not such entities. We're not completely abstract selves. We're always selves who have a history, have an form of embedment in society, have existing commitments. It isn't that we have to see how we could at all get any normativity, how we could at all get any kind of justified way of orienting ourselves. It isn't that we're lacking meaning or lacking normativity. We've, in a way, got too much of it. We've got a superfluity of different normative ways of thinking about ourselves. I know I ought to brush my teeth. I know I ought to take care of my cat. I know I ought to oppose George Osborne on virtually everything he says. I have all sorts of things I know I ought to do. I don't need, as it were, special general philosophical justification for that. I've got all these normative commitments already. Now, it is the case that all of those normative commitments don't naturally form a single coherent unit. There are conflicts, there are empty spaces, there are parts of my normative structure that are not very well defended. All sorts of things are true, but the appropriate situation is a situation of a person who's already in the world with a variety of different ways of orienting himself or herself, a variety of different values and a variety of different normative conceptions, who's trying to make his way or her way within that jungle of. So it isn't as if we're dropped in the middle of the ocean and how can we find the dry land? It's rather we're in the middle of a jungle surrounded by this mass of pullulating, palpitating, breathing, normative vegetation that's overgrowing us. And how do we get some kind of order in that? Not how do we get any normativity, whatever. So I think if you think about the problem like that, it doesn't become the same kind of problem. And now so that's one part of the misconception, which I think is embedded in this notion of nihilism. The second part of the kind of misconception that's embodied there is, I think, the idea that, well, once we had all of this, we really had a perfectly justified way of orienting ourselves, or even not justified. We had a universally accepted way in which everybody oriented themselves. And now we don't have it anymore. But that seems to be historically very, very naive, because people in earlier periods, it isn't as if they were little automata who simply knew all correctly how they ought to act and acted in that way. And we're just the ones who don't know how to act. They were just as confused as we are. They were just as much in the grip of a variety of overlapping, contradictory, and inadequate justifications and normative conceptions as we were, and they had to fight their way through the thicket too. So that's a second mistake, I think. The third thing I want to say, and this isn't exactly a mistake, but it's just a kind of historical remark, is that nihilism is itself inherently not a descriptive, a theoretical, or a substantive word. It's an argumentative word. It's a rhetorical word. It's a rhetorical strategy. It doesn't describe anything that actually exists. Bertrand Russell famously said, I am principled, you are firm, he is pig-headed. I say of myself that I'm principled. I say of you that you're firm. I say of someone else that he's pig-headed or stubborn. Well, nihilism is like the stubborn or pig-headed thing there. That is, the nihilism is inherently a word that's invented by certain people to denigrate those people who don't agree with them. So characteristically, it's religious people who have a vested interest in everyone believing the absolute normative claims of their theology, and who claim you must be a nihilist, you don't believe in anything, if you don't believe in what I believe in, because what I believe in is the only thing one can believe in. Now I merely point out that if I have this view, I can call you a nihilist because you don't believe in my particular brand of theological normativity, and it might not be the case that you don't believe in anything at all. You might just have different views about it. And this is in fact how it's used in the 19th century. Everybody is calling everybody else a nihilist. None of the people who are called nihilists think they are themselves nihilists. They're nihilists as the objects of the derogation of their enemies. So nihilism is a term used by your enemies to describe you. So that's a further thing I merely want to point out. And notice that really no one doesn't believe in anything, doesn't believe in any normativity. We're confused about things, we have problems, but it isn't the case that you find people who simply don't think anything has value. That just doesn't happen. That's pour faire peur aux enfants. It's a thing to scare children with. It's not a proper subject for discussion. So it is true that in the West we had for a long time a relatively coherent set of worldviews that were oriented around a kind of Christian framework. and we don't have them anymore. But that's a historical question. It's not a philosophical question. It's a historical question about how we move from one form of society to another form of society, which has different assumptions and different conditions of reproduction, rather than a question about how do we move from a society in which we've got normatively well-grounded views to nothing. It's a historical question. It's not that kind of philosophical question. So for that reason, I'm not terribly keen to think of nihilism as the central philosophical issue of the present. I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it.